Imagine a world completely different from the one you know. A world where the continents do not exist as you see them on any map, where the oceans cover places that today are deserts, where the air you would breathe would leave you gasping within minutes, and where the creatures that populate the earth are so strange, so wonderfully unlike anything that exists today, that they would seem drawn from the most unbridled imagination. That world existed, not in another galaxy, not in some distant corner of the universe, but right here, beneath your feet, in layers of rock that quietly guard a history of nearly 300 million years. That world is the Paleozoic, and tonight we are going to travel through it together, slowly, without hurry, letting each image settle gently into your mind. The Paleozoic is a geological era that spans approximately from 540 million years ago to 252 million years ago. Its name comes from the Greek and means, literally, ancient life. And what a life it was. It was during this time that life on Earth went from being almost invisible, microscopic, aquatic, and simple, to becoming something magnificent, diverse, complex, capable of conquering the seas, the skies, and dry land for the very first time in the history of the planet. Before the Paleozoic, life had been existing for billions of years, but in a rather quiet way. There were bacteria, single-celled organisms, some algae, layered structures called stromatolites that formed slowly in shallow waters. The Earth was a living place, but not in the sense that we understand that word today. It was life without eyes, without mouths, without movement, without sound. The Earth breathed in absolute silence. And then the Paleozoic arrived, and everything changed. Let us begin at the beginning, at the very first moments of this extraordinary era, in a period called the Cambrian. Say that word softly, if you like. Cambrian. It has something of music to it, something of mystery, and the period it represents is exactly that, a fascinating mystery that scientists have spent more than a century trying to understand in its entirety. The Cambrian began approximately 540 million years ago, and what happened during its first millions of years is one of the most astonishing events in the entire history of life on Earth. Geologists and paleontologists call it the Cambrian explosion, and although the name sounds violent, it really describes something more like an awakening, a sudden and exuberant flowering of radically new forms of life in a geologically brief period, which from our human perspective might seem long, but which, on the scale of millions of years, is almost a blink. Nearly all the major groups of animals we know today appeared in the oceans. The ancestors of worms, mollusks, arthropods, echinoderms, and also of vertebrates. All of them left their record in the rocks of that extraordinary time. Why did this happen? What triggered such an explosion of life forms? It is a question that remains alive in laboratories and scientific journals. Some hypotheses speak of changes in the chemical composition of the oceans, of an increase in available oxygen levels, of global climate shifts following an intense glacial period that had covered much of the planet. Other theories point to something more subtle, the appearance of eyes. Yes, eyes. Some researchers propose that when the first animals developed the capacity to see, to detect light and shapes, a kind of evolutionary arms race was set in motion that dramatically accelerated the diversification of life. Imagine it. In an ocean where before no one could see you, suddenly some animals could perceive your presence, your movement, your form. That changed the rules of the game forever. You had to adapt. to camouflage yourself, to develop defenses, to become faster or more hidden. And under that pressure, evolution responded with boundless creativity. The oceans of the Cambrian were worlds of a strange and serene beauty. Imagine warm and shallow waters covering most of what today would be the continents. In those seas lived creatures that resemble nothing you have ever seen, though they carry within their bodies the seeds of everything that would come after. One of the most iconic animals of this period is Anomalocaris, a creature that when first discovered deeply puzzled scientists because its different parts were initially classified as separate animals before it was understood that they all belonged to the same organism. Its name means anomalous shrimp, and indeed, it had something of a shrimp about it, but amplified and modified to the edge of recognition. It could reach almost a meter in length, making it the largest predator of its time. Its compound eyes were enormous in proportion to its body, probably capable of detecting movement with great effectiveness. It had articulated frontal appendages for capturing prey and a circular mouth with teeth. And yet, moving gracefully through those Cambrian seas, it must have been something close to sublime. But Anomalocaris, fascinating as it is just one among thousands of strange and wonderful organisms that inhabit the rocks of the Cambrian. There is a place in the world where these creatures were preserved with an almost incredible fidelity, preserved not only as bones or shells, but with their soft tissues, their intestines, their eyes, even the contents of their stomachs. That place is in the Rocky Mountains of Canada, and it is called the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is perhaps the most famous fossil deposit in the world, at least among those who know the history of life on Earth in some detail. It was discovered in the early 20th century by the paleontologist Charles Walcott, who found himself looking through a direct window into the past of an almost painful clarity. The creatures of the Burgess Shale died and were buried so quickly by sediment slides that their bodies had no time to decompose. The result is a photographic album of Cambrian marine life, still, detailed, silent in the way that only a rock can be when it keeps a secret 500 million years old. Among the creatures of the Burgess Shale, there is one that is especially enigmatic, and which for decades was considered literally impossible to classify. It is called Opabinia, and it has 5 eyes situated on the top of its head and an elongated proboscis at the front ending in a kind of claw. When Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most influential paleontologists of the 20th century, wrote about it in his famous book on the Burgess Shale, he described how the first time a reconstruction of Opabinia was presented to an audience of scientists, the room burst into laughter, not mockery, but genuine astonishment. No one could believe that this thing had actually existed. And yet, it existed. With its 5 eyes and its strange proboscis, Opabinia swam in those seas more than 500 million years ago, probably hunting small prey or gathering organic matter from the seafloor. It was real. It was functional. It was life. That is what makes the Paleozoic so special from its very earliest moments. Its capacity to remind you that reality is far vaster and far more creative than your everyday mind can imagine. Evolution. Working without a plan, without a direction, without predetermined destination, was capable of producing organisms of such extreme variety that everything that exists today seems like a simplified, almost conservative version of what was once possible. Let that settle for a moment as you breathe gently. Think of the oceans 500 million years ago, warm, quiet, full of forms of life that no human eye ever saw alive. but which fossils have brought back into the world of ideas, of wonder, of understanding. As the Cambrian advanced and began to give way to the next period, the Ordovician, the seas of the Paleozoic, remained the main stage of life on Earth. Dry land was still an inhospitable place, arid, without plants, without soil, in the sense that we understand that word today. Rocks extended bare under a sky of different composition, bathed in sunlight not filtered by the ozone layer that protects us today, because that layer depends largely on the oxygen produced by plants and algae, and terrestrial plants did not yet exist. But beneath the water, life continued to display its inventiveness in ways that still surprise those who stop to study them. The Ordovician, which began approximately 485 million years ago, was a time of extraordinary marine diversification. Reefs, not of coral as we know them today, but of different organisms called archaeosaths, and later of brachiopods and primitive corals, spread across the shallow seas that covered wide regions of the planet. In those reefs lived communities of beings extraordinarily complex for their time. The nautiloids, distant relatives of the current nautilus that you may have seen in photographs, with its spiral shell and its soft body peeking out between tentacles, reached in the Ordovician sizes that today seem difficult to imagine. Some of them had conical shells, straight as columns, that could measure several meters in length. They were the greatest predators of their time, undisputed sovereigns of seas in which life had not yet learned all that it could become. Imagine seeing one of those giant nautiloids moving slowly across the seafloor, its long, pale shell catching the filtered light from the surface, its tentacles extended, searching. There was something majestic about those creatures, something that invites contemplation. They were simple compared to what would come later, and yet complex compared to everything that had existed before. Life was advancing, step by step, period by period, building upon itself like a conversation that never ends. The trilobites, those organisms that are perhaps the most recognizable and popular fossils of the Paleozoic, also reached in the Ordovician a remarkable diversity. Trilobites are arthropods, distant relatives of modern crabs, insects and spiders, with segmented bodies covered by a hard exoskeleton that fossilized relatively easily. Trilobites have been found in forms so varied that it seems impossible they all belong to the same group. Some were round and smooth, others had long and delicate spines extending in all directions. Some had eyes mounted on long stalks. Others were completely blind because they lived in waters so deep that sunlight never reached them. There were trilobites so small they would fit in the palm of your hand, and others that reached almost a meter in length. Some swam, some crawled along the bottom, some rolled into a perfect ball when they felt threatened, just as woodlice do today in your garden. Trilobites are, in many ways, the most perfect representatives of the Paleozoic. Abundant, diverse, adaptable, present throughout almost the entire era, and then gone at its end, without leaving direct descendants in the modern world. There is something poetic about trilobites. They lived for more than 250 million years in the world's oceans, far longer than any comparably complex group of organisms has survived so far, and then they were gone. Their fossils are found on every continent, even in Antarctica, and each one of them is a small monument to persistence and to extinction, two forces that define the history of life as much as evolution itself. The Ordovician ended with one of the 5 great mass extinction events recorded in the history of life on Earth. About 440 million years ago, something occurred that caused the disappearance of approximately 85% of all marine species on the planet. The most accepted hypotheses point to a massive glaciation combined with variations in sea level. The oceans cooled, the shallow seas, so rich in life, retreated as water became trapped in enormous ice sheets, and the ecosystems that had taken millions of years to build collapsed in what, from a geological perspective, was a very brief time. And yet life survived, as it always has. Not all of it, not the same life that had existed before, but enough that when the cold relented and the seas warmed again, the process of building, of diversifying, of exploring the possibilities that biochemistry and physics allow could begin once more. The following period, the Silurian, is in certain respects one of the most fascinating of the Paleozoic, not so much for its dimensions or its most spectacular creatures, but for what began to happen along its shores. Because in the Silurian, around 420 million years ago, life began to take seriously the possibility of existing outside the water. The first terrestrial plants, organisms derived from green algae that were gradually colonizing the moist edges of the continents, began to change the face of the planet in a way that today, looking at the green world around us, is difficult to appreciate in its full magnitude. Before them, the land was rock and dust and water and wind. After them, the land began to be also life, also photosynthesis, also soil, also shade. Those first plants did not resemble anything that we would recognize today as a plant in a garden or a forest. They had no leaves, no flowers, no deep roots. They were simple, small structures that spread horizontally, close to the ground, capturing light and moisture, anchoring themselves to rock with primitive structures. But they were already there. They had already taken the step, and every centimeter of land that they colonized changed the world a little more. The Silurian period deserves more than a passing glance as we move through the Paleozoic, because within its relatively brief span of roughly 25 million years, a series of changes unfolded that would permanently alter the trajectory of life on Earth. We have already noted the appearance of the first terrestrial plants, but to appreciate the full significance of that development, we need to understand what the world looked like before it happened, and what the oceans were doing during the same time that the land was taking its first green breaths. The seas of the Silurian were recovering from the devastation of the late Ordovician extinction. That recovery was not instantaneous. Ecosystems do not simply bounce back overnight from the loss of the vast majority of their species. They rebuild slowly, opportunistically, with the survivors expanding into the ecological spaces left vacant by the dead. The first communities to reestablish themselves after a mass extinction are typically simple ones, dominated by a handful of highly resilient generalist species that can tolerate a wide range of conditions. Over time, as the environment stabilizes, more specialized organisms evolve, niches become more finely divided, and the ecosystem gradually regains something of its former complexity. The Silurian oceans went through exactly this process of recovery and rebuilding. Coral reefs returned, built now by rugose corals and tabulate corals, organisms quite different from the modern corals we know, but filling essentially the same ecological role, constructing calcium carbonate frameworks that provided structure and shelter for communities of extraordinary diversity. Brachiopods, those bivalved creatures that superficially resemble clams but are anatomically quite different, covered the seafloors in vast numbers. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies because of their flower-like appearance, though they are animals and not plants, attach themselves to the reef structures in dense gardens that must have swayed gently in the currents, like underwater meadows of an almost surreal beauty. Crinoids are worth pausing on for a moment because they are one of those organisms that most people have never heard of, despite being extraordinarily abundant in the fossil record and despite having living relatives that are genuinely among the most beautiful animals on the planet today. A crinoid consists of a long stalk anchored to the seafloor, topped by a crown of feathery arms arranged around a central disc. Those arms are covered in tiny tube feet that capture food particles drifting past in the current. The whole structure, when alive and moving in water, has the quality of an elaborate living sculpture, something between a flower and a snowflake, endlessly branching and swaying. In the Silurian and the periods that followed, crinoids were sometimes so abundant that when they died and their stalks and arms disintegrated, they formed thick layers of limestone that today, hundreds of millions of years later, we quarry and use for building. Entire hillsides in some parts of the world are made essentially of compressed crinoid remains, billions of tiny fragments of stalks and arms packed together by time and pressure into solid rock. When you walk on a path of pale limestone, there is a real possibility that the stone beneath your feet is largely composed of the remains of these ancient, beautiful, and almost entirely forgotten animals. The Silurian seas also saw the continued evolution and diversification of the jawless fish, those early vertebrates that lacked the biting apparatus that would later transform the possibilities of vertebrate life. Jawless fish, or agnathans as they are technically called, were the dominant vertebrates of the early and middle Paleozoic, and they came in a surprising variety of forms. Some of them, the osteostracans, had flattened bodies armored with bony shields on their heads and anterior trunks and lived on the seafloor, probably filter feeding or grazing on algae and organic matter. Others, the ladans, were more fish-shaped and covered in tiny scales and may have been more active swimmers. Still others, the heterostracans, had elaborate head shields of a complexity that suggests they were far from the simple, passive animals they are sometimes portrayed as. All of these jawless fish were doing something that no vertebrate had done before them, being a vertebrate. They were the first animals to have a true backbone, or at least a notochord that served the same structural function, a rigid central axis that allowed the muscles on either side to work more efficiently, enabling more powerful and coordinated movement. The backbone is one of those evolutionary innovations that seems almost obvious in retrospect because it is so fundamental to the way we and all other vertebrates move. But at the time of its origin, it represented a genuine breakthrough in the engineering of animal bodies. Think of what a backbone allows. It provides a rigid but flexible central support for the body, a structure against which muscles can pull to generate powerful, coordinated movement. It protects the spinal cord, the main highway of the nervous system connecting the brain to the rest of the body. It allows the body to grow large without becoming structurally weak. Almost everything impressive that vertebrates have ever done, from the swimming of a shark to the running of a cheetah to the flying of an eagle to the building of a city, ultimately depends on having a backbone. And it first appeared in those quiet Silurian seas, in small armored fish that were just beginning to explore what vertebrate life could be. The Silurian is also the period when jawed vertebrates, the gnathostomes, first became clearly established in the fossil record, though they may have originated somewhat earlier. The evolution of jaws is another one of those developments that transformed everything it touched. Jaws evolved from the gill arches, the bony structures that support the gills in fish. In the ancestors of jawed vertebrates, some of those gill arches were modified over evolutionary time to move forward in the body and become the upper and lower jaws. It is a transformation that seems almost too elegant to be accidental, and yet it was entirely accidental, the product of millions of generations of natural selection working on random genetic variation. With jaws came the ability to bite, to grip, to process food in entirely new ways. Before jaws, vertebrates were limited in what they could eat. They could filter particles from the water, rasp algae off surfaces, or perhaps swallow small prey whole. With jaws, they could bite pieces off larger organisms, crack open shells, actively pursue and subdue prey. The range of possible diets expanded enormously, and with that expansion came a diversification of lifestyles, of body forms, of ecological roles that would culminate in the extraordinary variety of jawed vertebrates alive today. Every fish you have ever seen with a mouth that opens and closes, every shark, every frog, every lizard, every bird, every mammal, including you, is a descendant of those first jawed vertebrates of the Silurian and Devonian. Your jaw is one of the oldest structures in your body. In evolutionary terms, older than your legs, older than your lungs, older than your hands. It connects you directly to those ancient seas. As the Silurian gave way to the Devonian, the changes that had been building slowly in both the sea and on land began to accelerate. The Devonian is a long period, spanning roughly 60 million years, and within that span, the world underwent transformations that, taken together, amount to one of the most significant chapters in the entire history of life. We have already touched on some of them in our earlier journey through this period: the rise of the great armored fish, the first forests, the tentative emergence of tetrapods on land. But there is much more to explore, and the deeper we look, the more remarkable the Devonian becomes. Let us begin with the oceans, because the Devonian seas were for much of the period places of astonishing biological richness. The reef ecosystems that had rebuilt themselves after the Ordovician extinction had, by the mid-Devonian, reached a level of complexity that rivaled anything the ocean had previously produced. These were not the coral reefs of today, built primarily by scleractinian corals that did not yet exist, but they were ecologically equivalent structures, diverse, three-dimensional, teeming with life at every level. The Devonian reefs were built by stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that secreted layered calcium carbonate skeletons, and by the ruggose and tabulate corals that had been diversifying since the Ordovician. Together, these organisms created physical structures of considerable size. Some Devonian reef complexes are among the largest biological structures ever built that provided habitat for an extraordinary array of other organisms. Fish in great variety, brachiopods, crinoids, bryozoans, trilobites, nautiloids, all found their places in and around these ancient reefs, forming communities of a complexity that we can only partially reconstruct from the fossil record. And the fish of the Devonian reefs were not merely background characters in this story. They were, in many ways, its protagonists. The diversity of fish in the Devonian is almost difficult to overstate. Every major group of fish that would dominate the oceans and fresh waters of the planet for the rest of geological time either originated or dramatically diversified during this period. The sharks were beginning their long history. The ray-finned fish, actinopterygians, the group that today accounts for the vast majority of all fish species, from goldfish to tuna, were diversifying rapidly. The lobe-finned fish, sarcopterygians, the group that includes the coelacanths, the lungfish, and the ancestors of all land vertebrates, were at the height of their marine and freshwater diversity. The placoderms, armored and varied, were everywhere. The visual impression of a Devonian reef must have been one of constant purposeful motion. Fish of many shapes and sizes moving through the water in every direction, some grazing on algae, some picking invertebrates from the reef surface, some actively hunting smaller fish, some cruising in open water above the reef structure, the whole system humming with energy and interaction. And over all of it, periodically, the vast shadow of a Dunkleosteus passing through the water like a slow, implacable force of nature. Dunkleosteus deserves a longer look than we gave it earlier because it is one of those prehistoric animals that rewards careful contemplation. It was not simply large. Many animals throughout the history of life have been large. What makes Dunkleosteus particularly remarkable is the combination of its size, its armoring, its hunting apparatus, and its ecological dominance. In the seas of the late Devonian, there was nothing that could challenge a fully grown Dunkleosteus. It sat at the absolute apex of its food web, as unchallenged a predator as has ever lived in any ocean. The skull and anterior trunk shield of Dunkleosteus were made of thick, interlocking, bony plates that formed a natural helmet and breastplate. The rest of the body was apparently more flexible and fish-like, covered in small scales rather than heavy bone, allowing for the powerful swimming movements that an active predator requires. The head could be lifted upward, while the lower jaw dropped simultaneously, creating a rapid expansion of the mouth that sucked water and prey inward with considerable force. This mechanism, a form of which is still used by many modern fish, allowed Dunkleosteus to strike fast before prey could react. Studies of the biomechanics of Dunkleosteus jaws have produced estimates of bite force that place it among the most powerful biters of any animal that has ever lived. Its shearing plates could slice through the armor of other placoderms, the shells of large invertebrates, or essentially anything else in its ocean that it chose to pursue, which is the scientific term for fossilized feces, attributed to large Devonian placoderms, have been found containing the partially digested remains of heavily armored fish, suggesting that even the most well-protected animals of the period were not safe from the largest predators. And yet, for all its power, Dunkleosteus was in some ways a prisoner of its own success. The heavy armor that made it invulnerable to other predators also made it energetically expensive to maintain and relatively slow to maneuver compared to the sleeker, unarmored fish that were evolving alongside it. As the Devonian ended and the placoderms vanished, the ecological space that Dunkleosteus and its relatives had occupied was taken over by sharks and large bony fish, animals whose lighter, more flexible bodies gave them advantages that no amount of armor could compensate for. Evolution does not always favor the most impressive solution. Sometimes it favors the most efficient one. The story of the placoderms is, in a broader sense, the story of a magnificent experiment that the history of life ran for tens of millions of years and then abandoned. Heavy external armor as a defensive strategy has appeared repeatedly throughout the history of life. In trilobites, in turtles, in ankylosaurs, in armadillosaurs, and it has worked well enough in each of those cases to persist, but as a strategy for apex predators, active hunters that need to pursue fast-moving prey over large distances. It has never been tried since the placoderms. The energy cost is simply too high. When the placoderms disappeared, they took their experiment with them, and nothing quite like them has ever evolved again. There is something melancholy in the final disappearance of the placoderms, as there is in all extinctions, but also something that invites a different kind of reflection. The placoderms were not failures. They were extraordinarily successful for an extraordinarily long time. They dominated the seas for more than 70 million years, diversifying into hundreds of species, filling ecological roles from small reef-dwelling grazers to the massive open water hunters we have been discussing. 70 million years is a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of the human genus. By any reasonable measure, the placoderms were one of the most successful groups of vertebrates that have ever lived. Their extinction was not a verdict on their quality as organisms. It was simply the universe reminding us, as it periodically does, that success is always temporary, always contingent on conditions that are themselves always changing. While Dunkleosteus and its armored kin were ruling the open seas, the freshwater environments of the Devonian were telling a different story. Rivers and lakes are more variable environments than the open ocean. They can flood, they can dry up, they can vary dramatically in temperature and oxygen content across seasons. They are, in ecological terms, more challenging places to live, but also places where the challenges themselves drive evolutionary innovation at a faster pace. The freshwater fish of the Devonian were meeting challenges that their marine relatives rarely faced, and in doing so, they were evolving solutions that would prove to have implications far beyond the ponds and rivers where they originated. The lungfish we mentioned earlier, with their ability to breathe air and survive in desiccated mud, are one example of this freshwater evolutionary creativity. But there were others. Among the most important of these freshwater innovations was the development of increasingly robust, limb-like fins in some of the lobe-finned fish lineages. The fins of a typical fish are primarily organs of propulsion and steering, flattened structures that generate thrust and provide stability in the water. But in some Devonian lobe-finned fish, the fins were developing an internal skeletal structure that made them capable of bearing weight, of bracing against the bottom in shallow water, of providing support in ways that purely hydrodynamic fins could not. This development was not, initially, about walking on land. It was almost certainly about navigating the complex, cluttered environments of shallow freshwater systems, pushing through dense underwater vegetation, propping the body up to hold position against a current, or perhaps lifting the head above the water surface to breathe air. The first tetrapod-like limbs were probably multi-purpose tools, useful in and near the water long before they were used for true terrestrial locomotion. The fish that were developing these proto-limbs were also, in many cases, developing more sophisticated respiratory systems. In the oxygen-poor waters of shallow Devonian ponds and swamps, the ability to supplement gill breathing with air breathing was enormously advantageous. Some of these fish had structures that functioned as primitive lungs, pockets of tissue in the throat, or upper digestive tract that were richly supplied with blood vessels and capable of absorbing oxygen from gulped air. Again, this was not initially an adaptation for life on land. It was an adaptation for survival in difficult aquatic environments. But it was exactly the toolkit that would be needed for a more ambitious transition. Consider the remarkable fact that the two key innovations required for terrestrial vertebrate life, weight-bearing limbs, and air-breathing lungs, both evolved initially as solutions to aquatic problems. Life on land was not a planned expedition. It was the accidental byproduct of fish getting better at living in shallow, weedy, occasionally hypoxic freshwater environments. The first tetrapods that crawled onto land were not trying to conquer a new world. They were just doing what they always did, which was to try to survive in the world they knew. And some of them found that certain behaviors that had been useful in shallow water were also useful on the adjacent mudflat. This accidental quality of major evolutionary transitions is one of the things that makes the history of life so endlessly fascinating. Evolution has no foresight. It cannot plan for a future environment. It can only work with what exists right now, selecting for whatever helps organisms survive and reproduce in their current circumstances. The fact that the solutions to current problems sometimes turn out to be pre-adaptations for entirely different future challenges is not design. It is the beautiful, improbable logic of natural selection operating over deep time. Let us think for a moment about what those early tetrapods were actually experiencing as they began to spend more time out of the water. The land was not, from their perspective, an inviting place. The air was full of a light and heat that had no equivalent in their aquatic experience. The ground was hard and unyielding in ways that water never was. Every movement required effort that the buoyancy of water had previously supplied for free. They were, in a very real sense, carrying the full weight of their own bodies for the first time, and that weight was a new and demanding reality. The sensory world of a fish moving out of water changes profoundly. Sounds travel differently in air than in water. The lateral line system, which fish use to detect pressure waves and water movements in their aquatic environment, becomes essentially useless on land. Vision works differently when the medium between the eye and the object is air rather than water. Smell, which in water involves dissolved chemicals flowing past chemoreceptors in the snout, in air involves volatile molecules drifting on currents. Every sense had to be recalibrated. Every behavior had to be relearned. Every instinct had to be tested against the new reality of the terrestrial world. And yet they made it. Generation after generation, those early tetrapods persisted, adapted, and slowly became better at living in this new world that was simultaneously dangerous and full of opportunity. The arthropods that were already established on land provided an abundant food source. The plants that had been colonizing the land surface for millions of years were creating ever more complex habitats, with shelter and shade and a growing diversity of edible material. The land was hard, but it was also rich, and the richness was available to anyone who could find a way to access it. One of the things that strikes me most about the early tetrapods, when I allow myself to really imagine them in their world, is their ordinariness in the context of what they were doing. They were not heroic pioneers, consciously pushing back the frontiers of the possible. They were just animals, trying to eat and survive and reproduce, doing what all animals do. The heroism, if we want to use that word, was the heroism of persistence, of a lineage that kept trying, kept surviving, kept passing its genes on to the next generation even as the challenges piled up. And in that persistence, across millions of years and countless generations, they changed the world more profoundly than any conscious act of will has ever managed. That lesson, the lesson of persistence without plan, of transformation through the accumulation of small steps, is one of the deepest truths that the fossil record has to teach us. Big changes do not usually happen all at once. They happen through the slow compounding of small changes, each of which is barely perceptible on its own, but which, added together over sufficient time, amount to something vast. The tetrapods did not decide to conquer the land. They just kept living and living and living and living. And in the process, they became something that had never existed before. The forests of the late Devonian, those first true forests that were just beginning to appear as we approach the boundary with the Carboniferous, deserve a closer look as well, because they were not simply a passive backdrop to the evolutionary dramas we have been describing. They were active participants, shaping the environment in ways that fed back into the evolution of the animals living within and around them. The first genuinely tree-sized plants known from the fossil record are the Archaeopteryx forests of the late Devonian. Archaeopteryx was a remarkable organism, not quite like anything alive today, a plant with woody trunks like a modern tree, but with frond-like leaves more reminiscent of a fern. It could grow to heights of 30 meters or more, creating genuine forest canopies that shaded the ground below and fundamentally altered the microclimate beneath them. Archaeopteryx forests are found on multiple continents in late Devonian rocks, suggesting that this plant spread widely and successfully across the landmasses of its time. The ecological effects of the appearance of these first real forests were profound and cascading. The roots of large trees penetrate deep into bedrock, physically and chemically breaking it down at a rate far greater than had previously occurred. This dramatically accelerated soil formation, creating deeper, richer soils that could support even more plant growth, which in turn created even deeper soils, a positive feedback loop that transformed the chemistry and structure of the land surface over millions of years. The increased weathering of rocks also drew down significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, contributing to a cooling of the global climate that may have played a role in the late Devonian extinction. Think about that connection for a moment. The evolution of trees with their deep roots and their woody trunks full of carbon-storing lignin helped cool the planet. The cooling of the planet contributed to a mass extinction that wiped out the majority of marine species. The mass extinction cleared ecological space that was subsequently filled by new forms of life that could not have evolved while the old ecosystems were in place. The trees did not intend to cause an extinction. The extinction did not intend to create opportunities for new life. And yet the chain of consequences ran from one to the other, across millions of years and across the boundary between land and sea, with the same indifferent inevitability that governs all physical and chemical processes. The land plants of the Devonian were also beginning to develop the variety of reproductive strategies that would eventually allow their descendants to colonize every terrestrial environment on Earth. The earliest land plants reproduced with spores, small single-celled structures that could be dispersed by wind or water, and that contained everything needed to grow a new plant as long as they landed in a sufficiently moist environment. Spores work well in damp conditions, which is why modern ferns and mosses, which still use spore reproduction, tend to be found in moist, shaded habitats. But spores are limited by their dependence on moisture, and a plant that relies entirely on spore reproduction is effectively limited to relatively wet environments. The seed, which first appeared in plants very near the end of the Devonian period, solved this problem in a remarkably elegant way. A seed is not a single cell but a complex structure containing an embryonic plant, a food reserve to nourish it during early development, and a protective coat that insulates the embryo from desiccation and physical damage. A seed can remain dormant for extended periods, waiting for conditions to be right before germinating. It can survive drying out in a way that a spore or an unprotected embryo cannot. The evolution of the seed effectively removed the reproductive dependence on moist conditions that had constrained plant colonization of the land, and the result, over subsequent millions of years, was the spread of plant life into deserts, into high mountains, into all the dry and challenging terrestrial environments that seed plants now occupy. The first seed plants, known as pteridosperms or seed ferns, are found in late Devonian and early Carboniferous rocks, and they do not look particularly dramatic as fossils. They look like ferns, more or less, because their leaves were fern-like in appearance. The seeds, small and relatively simple, are easily overlooked. But in those unassuming seeds lay the pine forests of the northern latitudes, of the flowering trees of the tropical rainforests, of the grasses that cover a third of the Earth's land surface, of every seed that every human hand has ever planted in every garden or field in the history of civilization. One of the most consequential inventions in the history of life is hiding in plain sight in the late Devonian fossil record, easy to overlook, immeasurable in its consequences. The Devonian also witnessed the early evolution of a group of organisms that, while not animals and not usually given starring roles in the drama of the Paleozoic, played and continue to play a role in terrestrial ecosystems that is quite literally foundational: the fungi. Fungi are neither plants nor animals. They are their own kingdom of life, organisms that obtain their nutrients by secreting digestive enzymes into organic material and then absorbing the resulting simpler molecules. They include the mushrooms you might find in a forest, the molds that grow on old food, the yeasts that leaven bread and ferment beer, and also, crucially, the vast networks of filamentous hyphae that thread through the soil of virtually every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth and form symbiotic partnerships with the roots of most land plants. Those partnerships, called mycorrhizal associations, involve an exchange of nutrients between the fungus and the plant. The plant supplies the fungus with sugars produced by photosynthesis. The fungus, with its vast network of fine hyphae extending far beyond the reach of the plant's own roots, supplies the plant with water and mineral nutrients, particularly phosphorus, that the plant could not efficiently gather on its own. This symbiosis is ancient, so ancient that mycorrhizal associations have been found in some of the earliest land plant fossils of the Silurian and Devonian, and it is ubiquitous, estimated to be present in the roots of approximately 90% of all land plant species alive today. Without fungi, in other words, the colonization of the land by plants would have been a far slower and more limited process. The thin, nutrient-poor soils of the early terrestrial environment were not welcoming substrates for plant growth by themselves. It was the partnership with fungi that allowed plants to extract enough nutrients from those challenging substrates to grow and thrive. The green world that covers the land today rests, quite literally, on a foundation of fungal networks threading through the soil, invisible and essential. The Devonian and Carboniferous also saw the beginnings of another ecological relationship that would prove enormously important: the relationship between plants and insects. The first insects, or at least the first organisms that we would recognize as insects in the broad sense, appear in the fossil record during the Devonian. And from the very beginning of that relationship, plants and insects were influencing each other's evolution in ways that neither could have achieved alone. Insects eat plants or parts of plants. They bore into stems, they mine through leaves, they feed on roots, they consume seeds and pollen, and nectar. Each of these feeding behaviors creates selection pressure on plants to evolve defenses. Tougher tissues, toxic chemicals, physical structures that make feeding difficult. And each defensive innovation by plants creates selection pressure on insects to evolve counter-adaptations. Enzymes to detoxify plant chemicals. Specialized mouth parts to penetrate tough tissues. Behaviors that avoid or disarm plant defenses. This evolutionary arms race between plants and insects has been running since the Devonian, since the products. The almost incomprehensible diversity of both plant and insect species alive today are among the most magnificent examples of evolution as a creative force that the natural world provides. But insects and plants also had, even in the Paleozoic, relationships of mutual benefit as well as conflict. Insects that visited plants in search of food inevitably carried pollen from one plant to another, inadvertently acting as agents of fertilization. This accidental pollination service would, in later geological periods, be elaborated into the extraordinarily complex and beautiful relationships between flowering plants and their pollinators that fill our modern world with color and fragrance. In the Devonian and Carboniferous, flower pollination as we know, it did not yet exist, but the foundation of the relationship between plants and insects, the mutual dependence, the co-evolutionary entanglement was already being laid. There is a thread that runs through all of these Paleozoic stories, a thread that becomes visible only when you step back far enough to see the whole tapestry. Life does not exist as a collection of isolated individuals or even isolated species. It exists as a web of relationships, of dependencies and competitions and co-evolutions so complex and so tightly woven that the fate of any one thread affects the whole fabric. The reef ecosystems of the Devonian, the forests and their fungal partners, the plants and their insect antagonists and pollinators, the fish and their tetrapod descendants. All of these are parts of a single interconnected story that has been unfolding on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. And that story is not finished. Every ecosystem on Earth today is a continuation of the story that began in the Cambrian seas, evolved through the Ordovician and Silurian and Devonian, and reached one of its greatest crescendos in the Carboniferous forests we are about to enter. The creatures that live in those forests today, the insects and birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians, are the latest chapters in a narrative that was already ancient when the first human being looked up at a night sky and wondered where it all came from. You are part of that story. Your curiosity, the same curiosity that is keeping some part of your mind awake even as your body relaxes and your breathing deepens and the edges of the day become soft and distant. That curiosity is one of the latest expressions of something that began in the restless, exploratory, never quite satisfied tendency of life to try something new, to push a little further into the unknown, to test what is possible one more time. The Paleozoic was life doing exactly that on the grandest possible scale. And tonight, in the quiet of wherever you are carrying that ancient impulse forward. Let it rest now gently as the oceans of the Silurian close over your thoughts and the forests of the Devonian grow dark and still around you, and the world becomes, as it was for so many millions of years before the first human thought was ever thought, simply beautiful, simply alive, simply at peace. The Carboniferous is waiting just ahead, green and vast and alive with giants. But first, rest. There is time. There has always been time. The rock remembers everything, and nothing is ever truly lost. Alongside the first plants, other organisms began to explore dry land during the Silurian and the periods that followed. Arthropods, that group which had already demonstrated in the seas a remarkable ability to adapt to all kinds of conditions, were probably the first animals to establish themselves permanently on land. The earliest known terrestrial arthropods are creatures similar to modern millipedes and mites, small, with bodies designed to take advantage of the moisture and organic matter that the first plants were beginning to deposit in the soil. They were not large or spectacular, but they were pioneers in the most literal sense of the word. They were doing something no animal had done before, living, growing, reproducing, and dying outside the water. Think about what that means. Life on Earth has been occurring in water for billions of years, where conditions are relatively stable, where buoyancy relieves the weight of the body, where moisture is guaranteed. Dry land is another world entirely. Gravity weighs more heavily because there is no water to cushion its effect. Air dries out tissues, temperature varies far more than in the sea. Ultraviolet light from the sun arrives with a potentially damaging intensity. Crossing from one world to the other is not a trivial step. It is a radical transformation. And yet, million by million of years, generation after generation, the organisms that ventured toward land found solutions to each of those problems. Thicker skins to retain moisture, articulated legs to bear weight without the support of water, respiratory systems that could extract oxygen from air, eggs with membranes that protected the embryo from desiccation. Each adaptation was a small victory of biochemistry over physics, of life over the limits that the environment imposed. We enter now the Devonian, a period that spans from about 416 million years ago to about 360 million years ago, known sometimes as the Age of Fishes, because in the seas of the Devonian, fish reached a diversity and sophistication that completely transformed the nature of aquatic ecosystems. Fish are not, of course, a novelty in the Devonian. Their most primitive ancestors, animals with notochords, and eventually with vertebral columns, already existed in the Cambrian and Ordovician, but it was in the Devonian that aquatic vertebrates really began to diversify in an explosive way, producing groups so varied that the oceans, rivers, and lakes of that time must have been places of a dazzling vitality. One of the most extraordinary groups of the Devonian marine world are the placoderms, fish with their heads and part of their trunks covered by bony plates, forming an articulated armor. Placoderms were the first vertebrates to develop true jaws, and that development changed everything. Before jaws, vertebrates were mostly filter feeders or scavengers, organisms that spent their lives collecting food particles or eating what was already dead. With jaws, they became active predators capable of attacking, biting, and consuming prey of considerable size. The most impressive of all placoderms, and perhaps one of the most imposing animals of the entire Paleozoic in terms of sheer predatory power, is Dunkleosteus. This armored fish could reach between 5 and 10 meters in length, making it one of the greatest predators that have ever existed in the Earth's seas. Its head was covered by massive bony plates, and instead of teeth, it had sharp cutting plates of the same material that, when closing, worked like scissors, capable of generating an extraordinary bite force. Researchers have calculated that the bite force of Dunkleosteus may have been comparable to that of modern crocodiles, and this in an animal that lived more than 300 million years ago. There was no animal in the seas of the Devonian that did not have to worry about the presence of a Dunkleosteus nearby. And yet there is something in the image of this armored giant moving through the Devonian seas that invites contemplation more than fear. It was a creature of its time, perfectly adapted to its world, part of an ecosystem that functioned with the same implacable and beautiful logic that all ecosystems do. Energy, flowing, matter, transforming, life, feeding on life to continue being life. The Devonian is also the period in which something truly extraordinary began to happen along the shores of seas and rivers. Some fish began to develop structures in their fins that allowed them, awkwardly and tentatively at first, to move across land for brief periods. These lobe-finned fish, named as such because their fins had a robust muscular base rather than being simple fans of bone and skin, are the direct ancestors of all terrestrial vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, of you yourself. The transition from fish to the first tetrapods, which is the name we give to four-limbed vertebrates, is one of the most fascinating chapters in all of evolutionary biology. And the Devonian is the period where that transition began to occur. Lobe-finned fish such as Eusthenopteron and Tiktaalik, the latter discovered in the early decades of this century in the Canadian Arctic and turned into one of the most famous fossils in the world, show with remarkable clarity how the skeleton of the fins was gradually modified to produce the structures that would later become arms and legs. Tiktaalik is especially fascinating because it sits at the exact midpoint of that transition. It had fish scales, breathed through gills, and lived in the water, but it also had a neck, something no fish before it had possessed, and its front fins had a skeleton with bones that clearly correspond to the humerus, the radius, and the ulna of terrestrial vertebrates, including yours. It could do push-ups in the literal sense. It could brace its fins against the bottom and lift itself up on them. It was, in every important sense, a creature halfway between two worlds. Why would these fish leave the water, even temporarily? The most plausible hypotheses speak of concrete ecological advantages: access to new prey along the shores, access to new prey, escape from aquatic predators in shallow waters that larger predators could not reach, the ability to move between pools when waters dried up in times of drought. Whatever the reason, the result was one of the greatest evolutionary leaps in the history of life on Earth. The earliest known tetrapods, such as Ichthyostega and Acanthostega, which lived at the end of the Devonian about 360 million years ago, were creatures that still depended greatly on water. They had functional lungs, but also retained gills. Their legs could support their weight on land, but were probably better designed for swimming than for walking. They lived on the blurred edges between sea and land, in that transitional zone that has always been an especially fertile place for evolution. And here is something that always surprises when it is mentioned. Acanthostega had 8 toes on each foot. Not 5, like most of today's terrestrial vertebrates, but 8. For a long time, it was assumed that having 5 digits was a fundamental characteristic of tetrapods, almost a law of nature. Acanthostega reminded us that evolution follows no fixed rules, that the number of toes is as negotiable as any other characteristic, and that the 5 that we and other mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians share is simply the solution that proved most successful, not the only possible one. At the end of the Devonian, another mass extinction occurred, the second of the Paleozoic, which especially affected marine organisms. The placoderms, those magnificent armored fish that had dominated the seas for tens of millions of years, disappeared completely, Dunkleosteus and all its relatives were gone forever. It was the end of a splendid chapter. But while the seas reorganized themselves after that extinction, on dry land, something completely new was taking shape. We had arrived at the threshold of the Carboniferous, and what awaited in that period is one of the most extraordinary spectacles that the Earth has ever produced in all its history. The Carboniferous, which extends from approximately 360 million years ago to 299 million years ago, owes its name to the fact that it is during this period that most of the coal deposits that humanity has been exploiting since the Industrial Revolution were formed. And those coal deposits are the compressed remains, transformed by millions of years of pressure and heat of the most extraordinary forests that have ever existed on the surface of the Earth. Imagine a forest, not the forest you know, not the oaks and pines and beeches of current temperate forests, not the Amazon rainforest with its cebas and orchids. Imagine something completely different. A forest of trees that are not trees in the modern sense, but giant lycopsids, plants that today exist only as small creeping plants a few centimeters in height, but which, in the Carboniferous, could grow up to 30 or 40 meters tall, with trunks up to 2 meters in diameter, covered in bark with a diamond pattern that makes them immediately recognizable in fossils. The end of the Devonian did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, like a tide that recedes a little more each time, leaving behind a shoreline increasingly bare and silent. The late Devonian extinction, which scientists sometimes divide into two separate pulses, separated by hundreds of thousands of years, was a slow unraveling rather than a sudden catastrophe. And that slow quality, paradoxically, makes it in some ways more haunting to contemplate than a single dramatic event. The world did not end in a flash. It faded gradually, species by species, reef by reef, until the oceans that had once been so extraordinarily alive became quieter, simpler, less themselves. The reef systems of the Devonian were among the most complex biological structures the planet had produced up to that point, built not by corals exactly as we know them today, but by organisms called stromatoporoids and tabulate corals and rugose corals. These ancient reefs had taken millions of years to grow, millimeter by millimeter, generation by generation, into towering structures that provided shelter and food for thousands of different species. When the late Devonian extinction struck, those reefs collapsed, not immediately, not overnight, but over a span of time that, measured in human terms, would still be incomprehensibly long. They went silent. The reef-building organisms died, and without their constant construction, the physical structures they had built began to dissolve back into the sediment. It would take roughly 10 to 15 million years for reef ecosystems to recover anything close to their former complexity. 10 to 15 million years of quieter, simpler oceans. Think about that the next time you look at a coral reef photograph and feel the urge to protect it. The capacity of an ocean to build something like a reef is not something that returns quickly once it is lost. But the story of the late Devonian is not only a story of loss, it is also, as every extinction in the history of life ultimately turns out to be, a story of unexpected possibility. Because while the sea was becoming quieter, the land was becoming busier, more complex, more alive, in ways it had never been before. And the creatures responsible for that transformation were the very tetrapods we met at the end of the previous chapter, those awkward, exploratory, astonishing pioneers who were learning, one generation at a time, what it meant to live without the sea beneath them. The earliest tetrapods, as we noted, were not fully terrestrial. Acanthostega, for all its forelegs and its 8 toes, was probably still primarily an aquatic animal. Its limbs may have been more useful for navigating dense underwater vegetation than for walking on land. Ichthyostega was perhaps a little more adventurous, capable of hauling itself onto shore in the way that modern sea lions do, using its front limbs to drag the back part of its body behind it. Neither of them would have looked graceful on land by any modern standard. But grace was not the point. The point was that they were there at all. What is particularly striking about these early experiments with terrestrial life is how different the world they were entering was from any world that vertebrates had experienced before. The forests along the riverbanks and coastal plains of the late Devonian were places of extraordinary novelty. The plants that had colonized the land over the preceding millions of years had, by the late Devonian, produced some genuinely tree-like forms with woody trunks and canopies that created shade. The first true forests, in the sense of dense stands of woody plants, tall enough to create a distinct understory beneath them, appear in the fossil record during the Devonian. And those forests, strange and primitive as they were, created an entirely new kind of habitat, a new set of ecological niches that no animal had yet figured out how to fill. Leaf litter, for instance. When plants drop their leaves, or in the case of the earliest land plants, their fronds and branches, they create a layer of organic material on the ground that becomes a habitat in its own right, home to decomposers, to small invertebrates, to fungi, to all the organisms that make a living by breaking down dead plant matter and returning its nutrients to the soil. That whole layer of life, that whole dimension of terrestrial ecology, was brand new in the Devonian, and the arthropods that had been the first pioneers of the land were already taking advantage of it, diversifying into a growing range of ecological roles that the forests were creating. But the vertebrates were coming. Slowly, experimentally, generation by generation, the descendants of those first tetrapods were learning to make more of the land, to move through it more efficiently, to find food in it more reliably. And as they did, the evolutionary pressure to become better at terrestrial life intensified. Animals that could move more efficiently on land had access to more food, more territory, more mates. The feedback loop of natural selection was doing what it always does, amplifying the small advantages, pruning the less effective variations, gradually sculpting bodies that were ever more suited to their new environment. The transition from the Devonian into the Carboniferous, which we will reach in the next part of our journey, is in some ways the moment when that feedback loop really began to accelerate. The tetrapods that crossed that boundary were already more terrestrially capable than their Devonian ancestors. Some of them still returned to the water to breed, as amphibians do today, but they were spending more of their time on land, exploiting more of what the land had to offer, and becoming, with each passing generation, less and less creatures of the water and more creatures of the air and soil and leaf litter. There is something almost dreamlike about imagining that world, the late Devonian and earliest Carboniferous boundary, those marshes and river deltas and coastal forests where the vertebrate conquest of the land was just beginning. The air would have smelled of vegetation, of damp earth, of the particular green richness of a young forest. The sounds would have been strange to our ears, the wind in unfamiliar trees, the buzzing and clicking of the arthropods that were already well established on land, perhaps the occasional splash of a tetrapod moving through shallow water. No birdsong, no frog calls, no rustling of mammals in the undergrowth. All of that was still tens of millions of years in the future. Just the wind and the water and the slow, patient sound of life learning something new. Let us stay in this transitional moment a little longer because it deserves our attention. We are so accustomed, those of us who live surrounded by terrestrial life, to the idea of land as a place full of animals that it takes a real effort of imagination to picture a time when it was not. But for the vast majority of the history of life on Earth, land was an animal-free zone. Bacteria, algae, and eventually plants had colonized the terrestrial surface. But animals, those mobile, complex, sensation-driven organisms, were confined entirely to the water. The moment when that changed, the moment when the first animal capable of surviving on land took its first breath of open air and felt solid ground beneath its body, is one of the most significant transitions in the history of our planet. It opened up an entirely new dimension of biological possibility. Every terrestrial animal that has ever lived, every beetle and butterfly and sparrow and elephant and human being is a descendant of that first crossing. Every one of us carries in our bodies the solution to the problem of living without the sea. And the solution is, when you think about it, quite elegant. The ocean provides its inhabitants with water, with buoyancy, with a chemical environment that is relatively stable and predictable. Life in the sea is life inside the solution it evolved in. Life on land means carrying that solution with you. The blood that flows through your veins, the fluid that surrounds every cell in your body, has a chemical composition that echoes, in a modified way, the chemistry of the ancient seas. You are not really a terrestrial creature in the most fundamental sense. You are a creature of the sea that learned to carry a little piece of sea around inside itself wherever it goes. The skin, the kidney, the complicated dance of hormones that regulates the water content of your body, all of these are solutions to the problem of living outside the ocean while still being, at the cellular level, a marine organism. Every adaptation that the early tetrapods developed for life on land was at its root a way of solving that fundamental challenge: how to keep the inside wet while the outside is dry. Now, with that thought settled comfortably in your mind, let us look more closely at what was happening in the seas while the tetrapods were taking their first steps on land. Because the Devonian oceans were not standing still while all this evolutionary drama was unfolding on the shores. They had their own stories to tell, their own experiments in progress, their own cast of extraordinary. Among the most fascinating of the Devonians' marine inhabitants were the coelacanths, a group of lobe-finned fish that first appeared in the fossil record during this period, and that have one of the most remarkable stories in all of natural history. For a very long time, coelacanths were known only as fossils, and scientists assumed they had gone extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, along with the non-avian dinosaurs about 66 million years ago. Then, in 1938, a museum curator in South Africa named Marjorie Courtney Latimer noticed an unusual fish among the catch of a local fishing boat. She did not know exactly what it was, but she knew it was something extraordinary. She preserved it as best she could and contacted a fish expert named J.L.B. Smith, who recognized it immediately for what it was: a living coelacanth. The coelacanth had not gone extinct after all. It had simply retreated to the deep ocean, to the cold, dark waters off the coasts of the Indian Ocean, and later discovered the Indonesian archipelago, and had continued living there, essentially unchanged, for hundreds of millions of years. The living coelacanth, Latimeria chelumna, looks astonishingly similar to its Devonian ancestors. It is one of those cases, rare and precious, where you can look at a living animal and know with a certainty that very few things in biology can provide, that you are looking at something that was already old when the dinosaurs were young, already ancient when the first forests were growing on a barren earth. The coelacanth is sometimes called a living fossil, though that term has fallen somewhat out of favor among biologists because it can give the misleading impression that the animal has not evolved at all since its ancient ancestors, which is not entirely accurate. But it does capture something true. Here is a lineage that found a way of living that worked so well in an environment so stable and so demanding of its particular skills that the pressure to change dramatically was never overwhelming. The deep sea is not a place that rewards radical experimentation. It rewards efficiency, endurance, and a body plan that works. The coelacanth found that body plan in the Devonian and has been refining it gently ever since. There is something extraordinarily calming about coelacanths. They move slowly through the deep water, using their lobed fins in a slow, almost meditative paddling motion, rotating them in a pattern that echoes, in a strange underwater way, the walking gait of a four-legged animal. They are mostly nocturnal, spending the day resting in underwater caves and emerging at night to hunt. They are, by all accounts, supremely unhurried creatures, going about their ancient business in the deep ocean with the quiet authority of something that has outlasted almost everything else that has ever lived. But let us return to the broader canvas of the Devonian, because there are more wonders to consider before we move on. The freshwater systems of the Devonian, the rivers and lakes and swamps that covered much of the land surface, were places of particular biological richness. It was in these freshwater environments that many of the evolutionary experiments leading to terrestrial vertebrates were being conducted, and they were busy, diverse, ecologically complex places. Among the fish of Devonian freshwaters were the lungfish, another group of lobe-finned fish that, like the coelacanths, has surviving representatives today. Modern lungfish live in Africa, South America, and Australia, and they are famous for one extraordinary ability. They can breathe air. When the waters of their lakes and rivers dry up during droughts, lungfish burrow into the mud, secrete a mucus cocoon around themselves, and enter a state of suspended animation called estivation, breathing through a primitive lung rather than through gills, waiting for the rains to return. They can survive in this state for months, or in some cases, years. The Devonian lungfish were doing essentially the same thing. The ability to breathe air was an enormous advantage. In the warm, shallow, seasonally variable freshwater environments of the Devonian, where oxygen levels in the water could drop dramatically during hot, dry periods. A fish that could supplement its oxygen supply by gulping air at the surface, or that could survive the drying up of its pond entirely, had a survival advantage that was simply enormous. And that ability to breathe air, that primitive lung, is directly ancestral to the lungs that you use right now in this moment to breathe. Your lungs are modified swim bladders, or rather, swim bladders are modified lungs. The fish that colonized the seas after the first vertebrates had evolved lungs were fish that no longer needed to breathe air because they lived in the open ocean where oxygen was abundant and there were no seasonal droughts to worry about. So they repurposed their lungs as buoyancy organs, filling them with gas to regulate their depth in the water. The swim bladder of a modern cod or salmon is, in evolutionary terms, a repurposed lung. Your lung is the original version. It was there first. That kind of deep evolutionary interconnection, the realization that the structures of your own body have histories that stretch back hundreds of millions of years and are shared with creatures that seem, on the surface, utterly different from you, is one of the most profound gifts that paleontology offers. It dissolves the boundaries between self and other, between present and past, between the familiar and the impossibly strange. Everything is connected. Everything has a history. Everything was once something else. The Devonian was also the period when sharks first became a significant presence in the marine ecosystem. Sharks are ancient, far more ancient than most people realize. The earliest shark-like fish appear in the fossil record in the late Silurian and early Devonian, and by the middle and late Devonian, sharks were already a diverse and ecologically important group in the world's oceans. They were not yet the apex predators. They would become in later periods, because the seas of the Devonian were still dominated by the massive placoderms. But they were there, diversifying, experimenting, finding their niches. What is remarkable about sharks, from a paleontological perspective, is that their basic body plan has proven extraordinarily durable. The cartilaginous skeleton, the replaceable teeth, the streamlined shape, the sensory systems for detecting movement and electrical fields in the water, all of these features were present in some form in the earliest sharks, and they are still present, recognizably similar in the great white sharks and hammerheads and whale sharks of today. Sharks have, like coelacanths, found a set of solutions to the problem of being a large, active marine predator that has proven extraordinarily resistant to the pressures of evolutionary change. That does not mean sharks have not evolved at all. They have diversified enormously over the hundreds of millions of years since their origin, producing a staggering variety of forms. The flattened angel sharks that lie motionless on the seafloor, the enormous whale sharks that filter plankton from the water with their vast mouths, the deep-sea lantern sharks that glow in the darkness of the abyss, the hammerheads with their extraordinary lateral expansion of the head that improves their sensory capabilities. But the core design, the essential sharkness of sharks, has been present since before the first forest grew on land, since before the first tetrapod dragged itself onto a Devonian shore, since before almost anything that we would recognize as a familiar animal existed on this planet. Sharks, in a very real sense, are the Paleozoic looking back at you when you see them in the water. They are the continuity of life, the thread that runs unbroken from those ancient seas to the present moment. Now, before we leave the Devonian behind entirely and step into the extraordinary green world of the Carboniferous, there is one more remarkable aspect of this period that deserves our attention: the extraordinary diversification of plant life on land. We noted earlier that the first land plants appeared in the Silurian, small and simple, barely distinguishable from the algae they evolved from. By the Devonian, those plants had been experimenting with terrestrial life for tens of millions of years, and the results of that experimentation were becoming increasingly dramatic. The Devonian saw the evolution of the first true vascular plants, organisms with specialized internal tissues for conducting water and nutrients through their bodies. It saw the evolution of leaves, those marvelously efficient solar collectors. It saw the evolution of seeds, though only in the very latest Devonian, that revolutionary reproductive structure that would later allow plants to colonize even the driest and most challenging terrestrial environments. And it saw, perhaps most spectacularly, the evolution of wood. Wood seems like such an obvious material, so familiar, so utterly normal to those of us who have grown up in a world full of trees, that it is easy to overlook what an extraordinary invention it represents. Wood is a biological composite material, a combination of cellulose fibers and a structural polymer called lignin that together create a substance of remarkable strength, stiffness, and durability. It allows plants to build vertical structures far taller than would be possible with soft tissues alone, lifting their leaves high into the air to capture sunlight above the competition. The first woody plants appeared in the Devonian, and their effect on the planet was transformative in ways that went far beyond simply making forests possible. Wood is extraordinarily resistant to decomposition. When the first woody plants died, the organisms that would eventually evolve to break down lignin, primarily certain types of fungi, did not yet exist in large numbers. As a result, dead wood accumulated on the forest floors of the Devonian and earliest Carboniferous in enormous quantities, rather than being quickly recycled back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. All that accumulated carbon was eventually buried, compressed over millions of years by the weight of sediments above it, and transformed into coal. The coal deposits of the Carboniferous, which gave that period its name and which powered the Industrial Revolution, are in large part the legacy of those Devonian and Carboniferous forests and of the temporary inability of the Earth's decomposer organisms to keep up with the rate at which wood was being produced. There is a pleasing irony in this story. The very material that humans burned to power the industrial transformation of the modern world, the coal in the furnaces of the steam engines that launched everything from railways to factory production, is the fossilized remains of ancient forests that grew in a world so different from ours that its creatures would be unrecognizable. The carbon that those ancient trees pulled from the atmosphere and locked into their woody trunks, carbon that was meant to stay locked in the rock forever, we have been releasing back into the air over the past 2 centuries, recreating in accelerated form a transformation of atmospheric chemistry that the Earth has not seen since those same ancient trees first changed it hundreds of millions of years ago. The deep past and the immediate present are more intimately connected than we usually stop to think. The Paleozoic is not a closed book. It is still writing itself through the carbon in the air and the rocks beneath our cities and the ancient fish designs carried in the bones of every vertebrate alive today. Take a slow breath and let that sink in. The oxygen you just inhaled was produced in large part by photosynthetic organisms that descend from the very algae that gave rise to the first land plants of the Silurian and Devonian. The carbon dioxide you exhale was, some portion of it, in the atmosphere of the Devonian and the Carboniferous, absorbed by those ancient forests, buried for 300 million years, and recently returned to the air by human activity. You are, in your breathing, participating in a chemical cycle that has been running since before the first fish swam in a Cambrian sea. Everything is connected. Everything is ancient. Everything, at some level, still in motion. Let us rest here for a moment before we continue into the green magnificence of the Carboniferous. Listen to your own breathing, slow and regular. Think of the Devonian shores, quiet in the late afternoon light of a sun that looked the same then as it does today, while somewhere in the shallows, a tetrapod is testing its legs against the resistance of the mud, doing something that no vertebrate has ever done before, going somewhere that no vertebrate has ever been, carrying with it, without knowing it, the entire future of life on land. The Devonian is ending, the Carboniferous is about to begin, and the world is about to become something that, even by the extraordinary standards of the Paleozoic, is almost beyond imagination. Those giant trees of the Carboniferous are called lepidodendron and sigillaria, and alongside them grew tree-like horsetails, relatives of the small horsetails you may have seen along roadsides or in damp gardens, but which, in the Carboniferous, reached 20 or 30 meters in height and formed dense groves along the edges of swamps. And among all of them, ferns in a variety and exuberance that today seems impossible to fully picture covered the floor and intermediate layers of the canopy, creating layers of green upon green in a warm and humid dimness. Those Carboniferous forests existed in a climate very different from today's. The continents at that time were distributed differently, with much of the emergent land concentrated around the equator, creating almost permanent tropical conditions of temperature and humidity over enormous extensions. Oxygen in the atmosphere reached during the Carboniferous levels far higher than today's. The air we breathe today has an oxygen content of approximately 21%. In the Carboniferous, that percentage reached as high as 35%. And that extra oxygen changed life on land in profound and surprising ways. Insects, which had appeared on dry land during the Devonian or perhaps even earlier, responded to that oxygen-rich environment in the only way that evolution knows how to respond to an opportunity, by growing larger, much larger. The dragonflies of the Carboniferous, belonging to an extinct group called Meganisoptera, are perhaps the most impressive insects that have ever existed. The most well-known of them, Meganeura, had a wingspan of up to 70 centimeters. 70 centimeters from wingtip to wingtip on a dragonfly. Slightly smaller than a sparrowhawk, slightly larger than a pigeon, flying above the Carboniferous forests, hunting other insects and even small amphibians. Meganeura was something that today seems almost impossible to integrate into our image of the natural world. And it was not the only giant. Carboniferous millipedes included forms such as Arthroplura, a myriapod that could reach 2.5 meters in length and probably between 50 and 70 centimeters in width. A millipede the size of a grown man, moving slowly across the floor of the Carboniferous forest, feeding on decaying plant matter. Its tracks, called trace fossils, have been found at several locations around the world, and they are one of those paleontological details that, when you discover them, force you to recalibrate your sense of what is possible on this planet. How could insects grow so large? Insects breathe in a different way from vertebrates. They do not have lungs, but a network of tubes called tracheae that carry air directly to the body's tissues. That system is efficient in small organisms, but it has physical limitations that make it difficult to supply enough oxygen to a very large body. With more oxygen in the air, those limitations were relaxed, and insects could afford to grow larger without suffocating. The rich air of the Carboniferous was, in a sense, the fuel that fed the giants. The forests of the Carboniferous also witnessed another event of enormous importance: the appearance of amniotes, the group of vertebrates that includes reptiles, birds, and mammals. Amniotes are distinguished from amphibians, which are the other terrestrial tetrapods, by a key reproductive characteristic, the amniotic egg. Amphibians, like modern frogs and salamanders, must return to the water to reproduce because their eggs have no protection against desiccation. The amniote developed an egg with protective membranes and a more or less permeable shell that could be deposited on dry land without the embryo drying out. That was an enormous leap of evolutionary freedom. With the amniotic egg, vertebrates no longer needed to be near water to reproduce. The entire continent was at their disposal. The first amniotes of the Carboniferous were small creatures, lizard-like in appearance, that lived at the margins of the swampy forests. But they already carried within their bodies the possibilities of everything that would come after: dinosaurs, pterosaurs, turtles, snakes, crocodiles, birds, and, yes, also mammals, and through mammals, ourselves. There is something deeply comforting in the idea that everything we are, every bone in your hand, every millimeter of your cerebral cortex, every beat of your heart, has its roots in those dark and humid forests of the Carboniferous, in those small lizard-like creatures that climbed the trunks of Lepidodendron while Meganeura soared above the canopy in search of prey. We are, in the most literal sense, children of that time. The Carboniferous ended with an event that geologists call the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse. About 305 million years ago, the planet's climate began to change significantly. The tropical regions that had sustained the enormous swampy forests started to fragment, to dry out in some areas, creating what ecologists call a mosaic landscape, with patches of forest separated by drier regions. For amphibians, which depended on constant humidity to survive and reproduce, that fragmentation was a disaster. Populations became isolated in surviving forest patches. Their diversity was reduced, and many groups went extinct. For amniotes, which could survive in drier conditions thanks to their more desiccation-resistant skin and their terrestrial egg, the new landscape was instead an opportunity. Their diversification accelerated, and they began to explore habitats that had previously been closed to terrestrial vertebrates. The last period of the Paleozoic is the Permian, which extends from approximately 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago, and it is a period of two very different phases. On one hand, the most varied and sophisticated flora and fauna that the Earth had produced on dry land up to that point. On the other, the greatest biological catastrophe in the entire history of the planet. But before the catastrophe, let us speak of life. The Permian is the period in which the synapsids, the group to which mammals belong, reached their first great era of splendor. Synapsids are amniotes distinguished from other groups mainly by characteristics of their skull, and although today the only surviving synapsids are the mammals themselves, during the Permian, this group was extraordinarily diverse and dominated the terrestrial ecosystems of the planet. The first important synapsids of the Permian were the Paleozoics, an informal group that includes some of the most iconic and visually striking creatures in all of paleontology. The most famous of them is undoubtedly Dimetrodon, an animal that is often confused with a dinosaur in the popular imagination, perhaps because its appearance is so dramatic and so unfamiliar that people automatically assume it must belong to the same group as Tyrannosaurus and Brontosaurus. But Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur at all. It was, on the scale of evolution, far closer to you than to any dinosaur. It was a synapsid, a distant relative of yours. What makes Dimetrodon so unmistakable is the enormous dorsal sail it carried on its back, formed by extensions of the vertebrae of the spinal column that could reach a meter or more in height and that were presumably covered in skin with a rich network of blood vessels. For decades, it was assumed that this sail functioned as a solar panel, helping the animal warm up quickly in the morning and regulate its temperature throughout the day. More recently, some researchers have proposed that it might also have served social signaling or mate attraction functions. It probably did several things at once, as the most striking biological structures usually do. Dimetrodon was also a formidable predator for its time, with differentiated teeth, something that contemporary reptiles did not have. Teeth at the front of the mouth for gripping prey, and larger, sharper teeth behind for cutting them. That differentiation of teeth, which specialists call heterodonty, is one of the characteristics that mammals would bring to its highest expression millions of years later. The pelycosaurs gave way further into the Permian to a more advanced group of synapsids called therapsids, and among them to an especially fascinating family called the dicynodonts. Dicynodonts were herbivores of varying size, some as small as a rat and others as large as an ox, with robust bodies and, in many cases, 2 tusks protruding from the upper jaw like small sabers. Those tusks give the group its name, dog teeth. But most dicynodids did not use those tusks for hunting, but rather for rooting up plants, digging up tubers, or perhaps for fighting among themselves. Dicynodonts were incredibly successful. They spread across all the continents of the Permian, adapting to a great variety of habitats, and some lineages even survived the catastrophe that closed the Paleozoic to continue in the following period, the Triassic, where they went on diversifying for tens of millions of years more. But before we reach that ending and that new beginning, we should pause for a moment on the geography of the Permian, because the world of that time had a configuration that had not been seen for a very long time before and would not be repeated afterward. All the continents of the planet were united in a single supercontinent called Pangaea. Pangaea, whose name means total land, was a continental mass of unimaginable dimensions that extended from the South Pole to near the North Pole, surrounded by a single ocean called Panthalassa, and with a smaller interior sea on its eastern flank called Tethys. Pangaea was the stage on which all terrestrial life of the late Permian unfolded. The implications of living on a single supercontinent are enormous. For animals, it means that it is theoretically possible to move from any point on the planet to any other without crossing an ocean, and the fossils of the Permian confirm this. The same genera of dicynodonts and other therapsids are found in what is now South Africa, Russia, China, and North America, because at that time, all those places were connected by land. But Pangaea also created extreme climatic conditions. The interior of such a large supercontinent was enormously far from the ocean in all directions, which meant that marine rainfall never reached there. Vast stretches of Pangaea's interior were arid deserts, perhaps the greatest deserts that the Earth has ever known in its entire history. The seasonal winds that oceanographers and meteorologists call monsoons must have reached in Pangaea an intensity and a seasonal variability that has no parallel in the modern world. Living in Pangaea was living in a world of extremes, and the therapsids of the Permian, with their adaptations for conserving water, with their teeth specialized for different diets, with their bodies probably more metabolically efficient than those of any previous reptile, were well equipped for that world. And then came the end of the Permian. What happened 252 million years ago is the greatest mass extinction event in the entire history of life on Earth. Scientists call it the Great Dying, and the name is completely appropriate. It is estimated that over a geologically very brief period, probably less than 1 million years and perhaps much less, approximately 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. 96%. Think about that for a moment. Of every 100 species that lived in the world's oceans, only 4 survived. The marine ecosystem that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build, with all its complexity, all its relationships of predation and symbiosis and competition, collapsed almost entirely. What caused such a catastrophe? The answer that scientists have been building over recent decades points to massive volcanism as the main factor. In what is now Siberia, approximately 252 million years ago, one of the greatest volcanic episodes in the history of the planet began. Not a single eruption, but the continuous flow of lava for thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of years, covering an area equivalent to half of Europe with layers of basalt several kilometers thick. Those eruptions are known as the Siberian Traps, and the scale of what they represent is almost impossible to visualize. With that, volcanism, massive release of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. Global temperatures rose. The oceans warmed and lost oxygen. Marine water became more acidic, dissolving the shells and skeletons of the organisms that built them. The carbon cycle, which had functioned for millions of years with relative stability, became unbalanced in ways that ecosystems could not absorb. The result was the Great Dying, the end of the Paleozoic, the greatest reset that life on Earth has ever experienced. And yet, and this is perhaps the most important thing that can be said about the Paleozoic, life survived. Not all of it, far from it, but enough. In the deepest oceans, in the most remote corners of the continents, in the cracks and niches that the catastrophe did not reach, enough survivors remained for life to slowly begin again. Let us retrace, with the gentleness this story deserves, everything we have journeyed through tonight. We began in the Cambrian 540 million years ago in oceans that suddenly awoke to an explosion of life forms so varied that scientists still debate the causes of that sudden creativity. We met Anomalocaris, sovereign of those seas, and the enigmatic Opabinia with its 5 eyes. We visited the Burgess Shale, that Canadian window into the deepest past of animal life. We then moved through the Ordovician with its giant nautiloids, through the trilobites in all their diversity, through the first mass extinction of the Paleozoic that reorganized marine ecosystems and cleared the way for new forms of life. We entered the Silurian and watched the first plants daring to step onto dry land, changing forever the chemistry of soil and air. In the Devonian, we found fish in their era of glory, with Duncolostus cutting through the seas like a living tank, and also the first tetrapods easing their reinforced fins above the surface of the water, testing a new world, unknowingly preparing the vertebrate conquest of the land. We saw Tiktaalik, with its neck and its fins that were almost arms, on the verge of making history. In the Carboniferous, we entered the forests of giant lycopsids into that green and humid and oxygen-rich world where dragonflies were the size of hawks and millipedes reached the size of a man. We watched the first amniotes appear, those small lizard-like beings that carried in their eggs the possibility of everything that would come after. And in the Permian, we witnessed the greatest flourishing of the synapsids, of the peleozoars with their dorsal sails silhouetted against the sky of the only supercontinent this planet has ever had, of the therapsidoration with their differentiated teeth and their increasingly efficient bodies, remote precursors of yourself. And then we saw the ending, the Great Dying, the geological fire that erased 96% of marine life and left the world beginning practically from scratch. But life went on, and it continues. Here you are, 300 million generations after those small, carboniferous creatures listening to this story in the dark. There is one last thing about the Paleozoic that I find beautiful and that I want to leave with you before sleep carries you away. Throughout this entire era of nearly 300 million years, through all the extinctions, all the climate shifts, all the catastrophes, and all the rebirths, life on Earth never stopped entirely. There was always something surviving, something adapting, something attempting a new solution to the eternal problem of existing. Life, it seems, has an instinct for permanence that goes beyond any individual, any species, any era. It is something transmitted, invisible and indestructible, from organism to organism through geological time, a chemical conversation that has been running for 4 billion years without interruption. And in that conversation, you are included. Your body is the latest word, for now, of a sentence that began in the Cambrian. Your breath is the echo of those first lungs that dared to take in air outside the water. Your hands, with their 5 fingers, are the solution that evolution chose among the many it tried, including the 8 of Acanthostega and the countless variations that time discarded along the way. Close your eyes if you like. Let the oceans of the Cambrian spread gently in your imagination, warm and still, full of creatures that no eyes have seen alive in 500 million years. Let the forests of the Carboniferous rise in the darkness of your mind with their diamond-barked lepidodendron and their enormous dragonflies crossing the canopy in silence. Let the Permian arrive with its desert landscapes and its therapsids resting in the afternoon light of the only continent in the world. All of that happened. All of that is real. All of that is stored in the rock beneath your feet and in the cells of your own body. The Paleozoic did not truly end. It simply transformed itself into everything that came after, into everything that you are. Good night.